In the summer of 1943, a Japanese army officer named Matsuda Kenji was stationed on a flooded island in the Philippines, and he had a problem. His unit had been cut off from supply lines for 11 days. The rice was gone, the emergency rations were gone, men were starting to collapse. Matsuda walked to the edge of a flooded paddy field. He stared at the water, and floating on the surface, covering every inch of it in a dense green carpet, was something he had seen 1,000 times and never thought about. A tiny fern, the size of a fingernail, growing on water, needing nothing. Tiny fern. He had watched Filipino farmers throw it into their fields for years. He had never known why. He took a handful. He dried it. He ground it. He fed it to his men. They survived. Matsuda filed a report when he returned to Japan. He documented the plant's protein content, its nitrogen-fixing ability, its growth rate in floodwater. That report was reviewed, classified, and filed away. And then, in a decision that still has no clear public explanation, the American occupation authorities, who oversaw Japan's scientific archives after the war, restricted access to a number of agricultural research files. The Azolla research was among them. It would be 20 years before Western scientists would rediscover what Asian rice farmers had known for 2,000 years. This is the story of a plant that grows in water with no soil and no fertilizer. A plant that doubles its mass every 2 to 3 days. A plant that fed rice paddies across China and Vietnam for centuries and was being studied by NASA as a potential food source for long-duration space missions. A plant that is currently classified as a federally noxious weed in the United States. And a plant that, if you know what you're looking at, might be the most important thing growing in a roadside ditch near your house right now. Before we go further, I need you to understand what Azolla actually is, because the name sounds like a garden pest, and that framing, that exact word choice, is part of how this story gets buried. Azolla is a genus of aquatic ferns. There are 7 species. They grow on the surface of still or slow-moving water, ponds, rice paddies, irrigation canals, flooded ditches. Here is what makes it unlike any other plant on Earth. Most plants need nitrogen from the soil. They cannot get it from the air, even though the air is 78% nitrogen. They need bacteria in the soil to convert it first. That is why farmers buy fertilizer. They are essentially buying nitrogen in a form plants can absorb. Azolla does not do this. Living inside the leaves of Azolla, in tiny cavities that exist in every single frond, is a cyanobacterium called Anabaena azollae. This is not contamination. This is a symbiotic relationship that has been evolving for 65 million years. The azolla feeds the bacterium. The bacterium pulls nitrogen directly from the air and converts it into a form the plant can use. Azolla is its own fertilizer factory, floating on the surface of water, requiring no soil, no inputs, no human intervention. It is converting atmospheric nitrogen into plant protein around the clock. The growth rate is what makes scientists stop and look twice the first time they read the data. Under optimal conditions, warm water, adequate sunlight, no competition, Azolla doubles its biomass every 2 to 3 days. Think about what that means in practice. You put 1 kilogram of Azolla in a pond on Monday. By Wednesday or Thursday, you have 2 kilograms. By the following week, you have 8 kilograms. By the end of the month, you have over 500 kilograms, from 1 kilogram in a pond without adding anything. The protein content runs between 25 and 30% of dry weight, comparable to soybean, which is the protein crop the American agricultural system is built around. Except soybean requires plowed fields, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, herbicides, planting equipment, and harvesting machinery. Azolla requires a pond and sunlight. And there is one more number that I want you to hold in your mind, because we are going to come back to it. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, the kind that goes on roughly half the world's crops, is produced through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. It consumes approximately 1 to 2% of the world's total energy supply every year just to make fertilizer. Azolla does the same thing for free, and it has been doing it for 65 million years. In the 7th century AD, something unusual began happening in the rice paddies of the Yangtze River Delta in China. Farmers were producing rice yields that later agricultural historians would struggle to explain. Not because the land was especially fertile, not because they had better tools, but because the water in their paddies turned green every spring, and they were letting it. The Kimin Yaoshu, an agricultural encyclopedia compiled around 540 AD, contains the earliest written record of deliberate Azolla cultivation. It describes farmers harvesting the fern from canals and spreading it across their paddies before planting rice. They called it the green manure. They had no concept of nitrogen fixation. They had no chemistry, no biology, no microscopes. What they had was 1,000 years of observation. They knew that the paddies where Azolla grew produced more rice. They knew that the paddies where they spread Azolla before planting produced even more rice. They knew what worked. They did not need to know why. By the Tang dynasty, the practice had spread across southern China. By the Song dynasty, it was integrated into the agricultural calendar the way planting seasons are integrated into ours. By the time European missionaries arrived in China in the 16th and 17th centuries, they observed something they could not adequately explain in their letters home, a peasant agricultural system that was feeding populations at densities that were simply not possible in Europe on the same amount of land. They attributed it to Chinese ingenuity, Chinese discipline, Chinese culture. They did not know about the green fern in the water. In Vietnam, the record is even more continuous. Vietnamese farmers have integrated Azolla into wet rice cultivation for at least 1,400 years. During the Vietnamese-American War, and I want you to notice this detail, when American forces used Agent Orange and other defoliants to destroy agricultural land and deny food to the Viet Cong, Vietnamese farmers retreated to their flooded fields. Agent Orange killed trees. It destroyed crops in soil. It did not kill Azolla. The fern kept growing on the surface of the water. It kept fixing nitrogen. It kept feeding the rice. American military strategists spent years trying to understand how the North Vietnamese managed to maintain food production in zones of chemical devastation. Some of those classified reports, declassified in the 1980s, noted the unusual resilience of rice paddy agriculture. None of them identified the role of the fern. And here is the part of this history that should make you stop. In 1978, 1 year after the war ended, the International Rice Research Institute published a comprehensive study on Azolla as a biofertilizer for rice paddies. The data was unambiguous. Fields inoculated with Azolla before planting showed nitrogen uptake equivalent to applying 30 to 60 kilograms of synthetic fertilizer per hectare and yield increases of 20 to 30% over unfertilized controls. The study recommended immediate and widespread adoption across Southeast Asian agriculture. In the United States, the response was a handful of follow-up papers, some interest from land-grant university programs, and then silence. Because 1978 was also the year the American fertilizer industry was reaching its peak post-Green Revolution growth. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer was a $4 billion annual market, and here was a fern that made it unnecessary. In 1982, a NASA scientist named B.C. Wolverton published a paper that would quietly become one of the most cited documents in closed-loop life support research. The paper was part of a larger NASA program examining biological systems for long-duration space missions, the kind of missions where you cannot resupply and where every resource must cycle back into itself. The question NASA was trying to answer was, what plants could sustain human life in a sealed environment with no inputs from outside? Wolverton's paper documented Azolla as one of the most promising candidates. The reasoning was straightforward. Azolla fixes its own nitrogen, meaning it requires no fertilizer in any form. It grows on water, meaning it requires no soil and no growing medium. Its protein content is high enough to supplement a human diet. Its growth rate means a relatively small surface area of water could produce meaningful quantities of biomass. And when used as feed for chickens or for fish integrated into the same water system, it functions as a food multiplication layer. The Azolla feeds animals. The animals produce waste. The waste feeds the Azolla. A closed loop, self-sustaining, indefinitely. NASA did not pursue Azolla as a primary food system. The program shifted toward other priorities. The paper was published, cited, and filed. But Wolverton's work was not ignored by everyone. In the early 1990s, a group of ecologists began building what they called the Azolla Foundation, a loose network of researchers and farmers attempting to document the full scope of what Azolla could do, not just as food, but as a carbon sequestration tool, a water purifier, and a soil rehabilitation agent. They found studies suggesting Azolla could absorb heavy metals from contaminated water. Studies showing dense Azolla mats reduced mosquito breeding by blocking surface access. Studies from India demonstrating that Azolla cultivation as a duck feed supplement could reduce commercial feed costs by 40%. The picture that emerged was not of a weed. It was of a plant that solved too many problems at once. And then, in 1990, the United States Federal Noxious Weed Act was revised. Azolla pinnata, one of the 7 Azolla species native to Asia and Africa, was added to the Federal Noxious Weed list. The official justification was that it was a potential aquatic invasive species. The regulatory language was almost identical, word for word, to the justification used to restrict kangkong, the water spinach we covered previously. It said it spreads rapidly through waterway systems, is difficult to control once established, and has the potential to displace native species. All of this is technically true. Azolla pinnata, if introduced into a warm freshwater system where it is not native, can spread aggressively. This is a real ecological concern. Invasive aquatic plants have caused genuine damage to native ecosystems. But here is what the regulation did not do. It did not distinguish between the invasive species and the cultivated species. It did not create a framework for contained cultivation, growing Azolla in closed systems, in containers, in isolated ponds, the way that farmer Matsuda was using it, the way Vietnamese farmers had been using it for 14 centuries. It treated the plant as a threat to be eliminated, rather than a resource to be managed. And the cultivation permits that technically exist in some states are not practical. The process requires documentation, environmental impact assessments, and ongoing monitoring, which makes permits functionally inaccessible for individual farmers or home growers. A plant that NASA studied as a food source for space colonization is, in practice, illegal to grow in a bucket in your backyard in most of the United States. I want to tell you something about Azolla that has nothing to do with farming. Something that geologists discovered in 2006, drilling into the seabed of the Arctic Ocean. The drill cores came up with something unexpected. At a depth corresponding to approximately 49 million years ago, the Middle Eocene period, there was a layer, not a thin layer, a massive, continuous, global layer of Azolla remains. It stretched across what geological evidence suggests was, at that time, a warm, shallow, nearly enclosed Arctic Ocean. The researchers who analyzed this layer published their findings in a paper that made a claim so large it took several years for the scientific community to process it fully. They proposed that Azolla had caused a global cooling event. Here is the mechanism. For approximately 800,000 years, Azolla grew on the surface of the Arctic Ocean in such density and fixed so much carbon dioxide into organic matter, and that organic matter sank to the ocean floor in such quantity that the global atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide dropped dramatically. Earth's temperature followed. The planet began its long cooling from Eocene warmth to something closer to the climate we inhabit today. A fern growing on water, no soil, no fertilizer, changed the atmosphere of Earth. And it did this over a span of time so long that it makes the entire history of human agriculture look like a rounding error. The researchers who published the Azolla Event paper were not writing about food or farming. They were writing about climate. But the implication that landed hardest in agricultural and environmental circles was this. If Azolla had the capacity to pull that much carbon from the atmosphere under natural conditions over geological time, what could a deliberate, cultivated Azolla system do in the span of human lifetimes? There are currently research programs in the Netherlands, in India, in Japan, and at several American universities studying exactly this question. Growing Azolla at scale, not just as food or fertilizer, but as a carbon capture tool. The results so far are preliminary, but they are not discouraging. A 2022 paper from Wageningen University estimated that Azolla cultivation on the scale of 5% of the world's freshwater surface area could sequester carbon at rates comparable to the annual emissions of several medium-sized industrialized countries. That research is ongoing. It is not being fast-tracked. It is not being funded at the level that its potential would suggest. And it is absolutely not being translated into the kind of public awareness campaign that would explain to ordinary people that the green fern growing in the ditch beside the highway might be one of the most consequential organisms on Earth. I want to go back to Matsuda Kenji for a moment, the Japanese officer who fed his unit with Azolla in 1943. I told you his report was classified, that access was restricted. That is true. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming here, because this story is complicated and honesty matters. I am not claiming there was a conspiracy to suppress Azolla. I am not claiming Monsanto or the fertilizer industry held secret meetings and decided to bury a fern. The history is messier and more mundane than that, and in some ways more troubling. What I am saying is this. Azolla's properties have been documented in peer-reviewed literature since at least the 1940s. Its ability to fix nitrogen has been understood since the 1960s. Its potential as a biofertilizer was established by the 1970s. NASA studied it in the 1980s. Its carbon sequestration potential has been documented since 2006. At every point where this knowledge could have moved from research papers into widespread practice, into extension office programs, into agricultural school curricula, into government food security initiatives, something else happened instead. The fertilizer market grew. The herbicide market grew. The seed patent market grew. The industrial food system that requires farmers to purchase inputs every year, that requires consumers to buy food they could not produce themselves, that requires the entire chain of transport, packaging, and retail to function between a plant and a plate, grew. Azolla, which requires none of that, which opts out of every purchase in that chain, which a farmer can propagate from a handful taken from a pond, which cannot be patented because it cannot be owned, stayed in the research papers. The regulatory classification is real. The noxious weed designation is real, and I understand why it exists. Invasive aquatic species do cause environmental damage, and that concern is legitimate. But I want you to consider a parallel. Glyphosate, Roundup, the herbicide that has been the subject of over 100,000 cancer lawsuits, that has been linked to non-Hodgkin lymphoma in studies by the World Health Organization Cancer Research Arm, and that has contaminated groundwater across the American Midwest, is fully legal. It is available at every garden center. It is recommended by extension offices. It is subsidized indirectly through the Roundup Ready seed patents that make it necessary. A plant that fixes its own nitrogen, grows on water, and has been feeding humans for 2,000 years requires a federal permit. A chemical linked to cancer is on the shelf at Home Depot. I am not telling you what to think about that. I am asking you to look at it. Here is what you can actually do with this information. First, the legal picture. Azolla pinnata, the Asian and African species, is federally restricted. Several other Azolla species, including Azolla caroliniana and Azolla folliculoides, are native to North America and are not on the Federal Noxious Weed list. Regulations vary by state. Before cultivating any Azolla, check your state noxious weed registry. In practice, contained cultivation in sealed containers, indoor aquaponic systems, or raised tanks with no drainage to natural waterways is the low-risk path in most jurisdictions. The same principle that applies to Hong Kong applies here. The regulatory apparatus cares about ecological escape, not about what is in your tank. Second, what Azolla can actually do in a contained system. If you keep chickens, Azolla as a feed supplement has been documented in peer-reviewed trials to reduce commercial feed consumption by 30 to 40% while maintaining or improving egg production. The protein content is sufficient to replace a meaningful fraction of commercial pellet feed. If you keep fish, tilapia, catfish, carp, Azolla functions both as a direct feed source and as a water quality management tool. Azolla mats absorb excess nitrogen and phosphorus from fish waste, reducing the frequency of water changes required in aquaponic systems. If you grow vegetables, dried and incorporated Azolla functions as a slow-release nitrogen fertilizer. The practice Vietnamese farmers have been using for 14 centuries works in a container garden in an American suburb. Third, cultivation is genuinely simple. Azolla requires still or slow-moving water. It requires sunlight 4 to 6 hours daily, minimum. It requires temperatures above 15 degrees Celsius and below 35 degrees Celsius. It requires essentially nothing else. Place a handful in a container of water. Within 2 weeks, you will have enough to harvest the first time. Harvest by scooping, leaving a quarter of the mat to continue growing. The harvested material can be fed fresh, dried, or composted. The reason Vietnamese farmers did not need agricultural extension offices or government programs to maintain this practice for 14 centuries is that it is fundamentally this simple. I want to end where we started. In 1943, Matsuda Kenji fed his unit with a fern he found floating on the surface of a flooded field. He filed a report. The report was archived. The farmers in the fields around him had been feeding their families with the same fern for 1,000 years. They did not need a report. They did not need a research institute. They did not need a regulatory framework. They needed water. They needed the fern, and the fern needed nothing. The knowledge has always been here. It was growing in the ditches. It was documented in the papers. It was filed in the archives. The only thing missing was someone willing to look at it. You just did. If this opened something for you, if you want to know what else is growing in ditches, rice paddies, and flooded fields that the modern food system decided you did not need to know about, This channel documents exactly that. The crops that disappeared from the modern food system. The foods that history forgot. The knowledge that quietly fell out of use. Subscribe. The next one is already growing.